Pretty soon, as the country begins to figure out how we open back up and move forward, very powerful forces will try to convince us all to get back to normal. That never happened. What are you talking about? Billions of dollars will be spent on advertising, messaging, and television and media content to make you feel comfortable again. It will come in the traditional forms, a billboard here, 100 commercials there, and in new media forms, a 2020 generation of memes to remind you that what you want again is normalcy. In truth, you want the feeling of normalcy, and we all want it. We want desperately to feel good again, to get back to the routines of life, to not lie in bed at night wondering how we're going to afford our rent and bills, to not wake to an endless scroll of human tragedy on our phones, to have a cup of perfectly brewed coffee and simply leave the house for work. The need for comfort will be real, and it will be strong, and every brand in America will come to your rescue, dear consumer, to help take away that darkness and get life back to the way it was before the crisis. I urge you to be well aware of what is coming. What is about to be unleashed on American society will be the greatest campaign ever created to get you to feel normal again. It will come from brands, it will come from government, it will even come from each other, and it will come from the left and from the right. We will do anything, spend anything, believe anything, just so we can take away how horribly uncomfortable all of this feels. And on top of that, just to turn the screw that much more, will be the one effort that's even greater, the all-out blitz to make you believe you never saw what you saw. You didn't see inequality. You didn't see indifference. You didn't see utter failure of leadership and systems. From one citizen to another, I beg of you, take a deep breath, ignore the deafening noise, and think deeply about what you want to put back into your life. This is our chance to define a new version of normal, a rare and truly sacred, yes, sacred, opportunity to get rid of the BS and to only bring back what works for us, what makes our lives richer, what makes our kids happier, what makes us truly proud.
I am very thankful that Nicole agreed to approach with me such a loaded service theme this Sunday. Perhaps every week this year will feel loaded in a way. Today's service topic, though, was birthed from a proposition that went viral on social media this past month, created by cultural organizer and educator Kate Deciccio. The proposition, referring to this current pandemic we are facing as a world, goes like this. She wrote, "If we get this right, we will never go back to normal. If we get this right, we will never go back to normal." Our board president, Kate Hyatt, lifted those words up in a service nearly a month ago now, and they have been swirling in my mind and heart, and perhaps yours too, ever since. This is an extremely provocative proposition, an alluring invitation. If we get this right, we will never go back to normal. If we get this right, if we face this pandemic in a particular way, if we realize what is truly being revealed, because there is so much that is being revealed these days, it is, in fact, an apocalyptic time, which from its etymological root means to uncover that which is happening around us, which we can see, and to uncover so much more that we cannot. The reading that will guide our 4 reflections today is worth your time and attention. It is worth taking in deeply and then taking it in again. It centers around a counter proposition, which we run the risk of accepting if we are not careful. This has to do with what happens as our cities and states, as our nation and the world begins to open up again and to get back to this idea of normal. So normalcy is related to both propositions. And the author of our reading didn't create a summative viral proposition. And so humbly and in the same vein as Kate Deciccio, I submit this one. If those with power have their way, we will awake from this nightmare with gratitude to just return to the way things used to be. If those with power have their way, we will awake from this nightmare with gratitude to just return to the way things used to be. But here's the thing. The way things used to be, and in fact still are on the whole, are rooted in extreme forms of oppression, of an addicted relationship to capitalism, to militarism, to white supremacy and patriarchy. Those with power want us all to want nothing more than to get back to normal. Gaslighting is the operative word that is functioning in the second proposition. And the author, Julio Vincent Gambuto, wants nothing more than to warn us to not be allured by the saturation of comfort and spending and the familiarity that will rain down on us for months and years to come as this pandemic begins to subside. I like to believe that we are a thoughtful and reflective congregation. We are a community of hope and courage, and during this time of COVID-19, we each in our own ways may be thinking about our lives, our families, our relationships to others, perhaps to our jobs, or our communities of engagement and to this world. I know you've been thinking about this time and what it means in not just US history or world history, but in your personal history, and what it means for your future and for our future. Nicole has been a wonderful thought partner, as have many of you, as we begin to imagine what it would look like to get this right, to explore what Gambuto calls the sacred opportunity to cut through the BS and to only bring back what works for us, what makes our lives richer and what makes our kids happier, what makes us truly proud. What will keep us as a congregation embodying our mission more boldly and feel more assured that we are fulfilling our aspirational ends? I expect that we can get this right. And it will take all of us to look into our own lives and consider what that will look like for each of us as individuals and as a community. Here is Nicole's reflection, and I hope it stimulates your own.
I haven't quite figured out what the ultimate lesson that this pandemic is teaching me about my own life. It's, I think, a little bit like using Google Maps. It's hard to zoom out really far and see the big picture when I'm just trying to figure out how to get down the street, or in this case, just to keep myself and loved ones safe and healthy. Some days I want to bake bread from scratch and exercise, and other days I just want to eat cookies and watch mindless television. And I realize that I'm privileged to be able to have those options. So to me, that makes it even more of a waste to ignore any life lessons that are presenting themselves, even if the path ahead isn't entirely clear. I think my biggest takeaway has been the importance of reflection. And I mean that both looking inwardly and also asking it of others in my life. If you've ever edited photos digitally, you might know that one of the things you can adjust is the saturation, which is basically how vivid the colors are. For me, life is fully saturated right now. Everything is felt more deeply and more extremely. The joys and the sorrows, the blessings and the frustrations, the perks and the disappointments. I cry more easily, but I also laugh readily. And I realize now how often I tend to gloss over those emotions when life is busier and more distracting and when I'm prioritizing steadiness and calm. It's like I've suddenly given myself permission to not be okay all the time. After all, there is no GPS for navigating a pandemic. to instead ask what my own mind, body, and spirit require to get through the day or even the next hour. And I'm trying to be more conscious of what my family and those I'm connected with, even if it is just virtually, need right now too. It's often different from what I need, and I'm learning to be more accepting and grace giving to others. And sometimes I fall short. It reminds me of our check-ins that we often do at the start of a meeting with committees or teams within our congregation. It's usually the only time in the course of that day, or maybe even that week or month, when I pause to ask myself before sharing with the group, how am I doing? And we learn so much about each other from those moments, don't we? So if I take one skill that I'm using for survival into this next phase of life post-quarantine, I hope it's that instead of always absent-mindedly answering, oh, I'm fine, to the casual, how are you doing questions, I can instead pause to be more thoughtful about my answer. And perhaps more importantly, when I ask it of others, can I do it in such a way as to suggest that it's okay to be vulnerable with me and to answer that more honestly? I don't know what my new normal will look like, but I hope it includes more of that.
What the trauma has shown us, though, cannot be unseen. A carless Los Angeles has clear blue skies as pollution has simply stopped. In a quiet New York, you can hear the birds chirp in the middle of Madison Avenue. Coyotes have been spotted on the Golden Gate Bridge. These are the postcard images of the world, of what the world might be like if we could find a way to have a less deadly daily effect on the planet. What's not fit for a postcard are the other scenes we have witnessed. A healthcare system that cannot provide basic protective equipment for its frontline workers, small businesses and very large ones that do not have enough cash to pay their rent or workers, sending over 16 million people to seek unemployment benefits, a government that has so severely damaged the credibility of our media that 300 million people don't know who to listen to for their basic facts that can save their lives. The cat is out of the bag. We as a nation have deeply disturbing problems. You're right. That's not news. But they are problems we ignore every day. Not because we're terrible people or because we don't care about fixing them, but because we don't have time. It is very easy to close your eyes to a problem when you barely have enough time to close them to sleep. The greatest misconception among us, which causes deep and painful social and political tension every day in this country, is that we somehow don't care about each other. This couldn't be further from the truth. We do care. We just don't have the time to do anything about it. Maybe that's just me, but maybe it's you too. What happened is inexplicably incredible. It's the greatest gift ever unwrapped. Not the deaths, not the virus, but the great pause. It is, in a word, profound. Please don't recoil from the bright light beaming through the window. I know it hurts your eyes. It hurts mine too, but the curtain is wide open. What the crisis has given us is a once-in-a-lifetime chance to see ourselves and our country in the plainest of views. At no other time, even in our lives, have we gotten the opportunity to see what would happen if the world simply stopped. Here it is. We're in it. If we want to create a better country and a better world for our kids, and if we want to make sure we are even sustainable as a nation and as a democracy, we have to pay attention to how we feel right now. I cannot speak for you, but I imagine you feel like I do, devastated, depressed, and heartbroken.
No question, this pandemic is putting all that ails our society squarely under the microscope. From the long-term effects of systemic racism, to far too many people working without a living wage, to a healthcare system that was always cracked and fractured and now seems to be crumbling, despite the truly heroic and superhuman efforts of its staff and frankly, so many of our essential workers. Will this be the moment when we finally decide to throw on our lab coats and look deeply into that microscope, studying what's being magnified right now, and then ultimately, hopefully, finding some cures and antidotes and doing something about it. Gambuto raises a really interesting point in this piece as far as the availability of time. And frankly, I think he lets America off the hook by suggesting we've always cared about our troubles, we just lack the time. I struggle to accept that. I think to some extent, many of us have always had the time. I think we just don't make the time. And shame on us if we don't adjust course now that the error of our ways has more fully presented itself to us. Yes, it's true. The average American lifestyle is just too busy. There is more that's making us sick than just this virus. From professions that require more than an actual full-time workload could realistically manage, to lack of access to quality childcare, to Herculean expectations that we place on ourselves. And so I recognize Gambuto's point, but I also ask myself, am I just choosing to be this busy? Because in part it makes it easier to look away from the many things destroying the fabric that hold our communities together? Are my priorities just not where they should be? There's a Mary Oliver poem called The Uses of Sorrow that I keep thinking about. Many of you may know it, and I find it particularly applicable in this moment. It reads, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift." I wish more than anything that this pandemic wasn't dropped on our porches like an unwelcome guest. But it's here, and we're either going to invite it in and better understand what it's trying to teach us, and then roll up our sleeves and get to work in the time we have left. Or we're going to ignore it and let it and all it has shown us keep infecting us. I hope that as a congregation, we can hold each other accountable and choose to work.
I share Nicole's hope that as a congregation, we can hold each other accountable and choose to work. To what work will we hold ourselves accountable? That is the most important question that faces us as we move forward as a congregation. We have a remarkable and nuanced set of guiding principles as Unitarian Universalists, a set of core values that we developed together, and a mission and end statements that are actionable, that are achievable, that call us forward from this difficult time. But if we get this right, if we really get this right, then we will have to recognize that we cannot go back, that we cannot turn back nor return to one another in the ways of yesterday, in the ways of pre-COVID-19. And here is why. The world has undeniably changed. You and I, we have changed. We cannot see all the ways we've changed or name them, but when we are able to return to one another in person, we will not be the same people. And so while our principles, values, mission, and ends are powerful markers of our identity, purpose, and direction as a congregation, the premier question we must ask, the guiding question for us, is not what we do to embody our mission and fulfill our ends. It's not about what we do together, but first and foremost and always, it is about how we are. Not what we do, but how we are. How we are as a congregation, how we live our lives, how we engage with our partners, how we move forward together. These are the questions we will ask again and again. And do you know why? Because our values of one another, of human life, of life itself, have changed. During this time of social isolation, of uncertainty and fear, our first question is, how are you? How is your mother? How is your child? How are you holding up? How can I help? And what did our question or questions used to be of one another? What did you do today? What are you doing this weekend? Or when you meet someone new, our first question is often, what do you do for a living? Now go with me on this for a second. What's the difference between the two? Between the old questions and of what, the old questions of what, and the new questions of how? What did you do today? What do you do for a living? These are questions about production, about our productivity, about what we've produced. What you do for a living is a question asking us to consider what we do to live, to be alive, to stay alive. In other words, it wraps up our existence with our production. And what we produce and the volume of our production as such is proportional in that world, in that moment of our first impression of the one before us and of each other. From this viewpoint, consciously or unconsciously, your level of production is your level of worth in society. And that makes complete sense in a capitalist society, in a society built on the backs of enslaved and indigenous peoples, and a nation that refers to opening up its economy and ending the shelter in place of its people interchangeably. We are the modes of production, of trading goods, of reinforcing the understanding that what you do and what you have is of ultimate concern in life. But as I said earlier, this pandemic has changed us. From our second reading, our second excerpt, Gambuto suggests that even as gaslighting will clearly gear up in the weeks and months ahead, quote, what the trauma has shown us, though, cannot be unseen. And we cannot unsee not only the oppressions and disparities of how this pandemic has hit marginalized communities and the heartless and draconian governmental leadership, if you can call it that, which was on display and still is on display. We can also not unsee the new ways we have grown closer to one another in righteous resistance to our Darwinian instincts. For many segments of society, it is not survival of the fittest, but a new model of shared existence is becoming popularized to the masses during this crisis. Thus, our questions during this crisis are switching from what, or questions of production as worth, to how, or questions of quality of life as worth. How are you is a direct question of another's life itself. There are no prerequisite questions of value based on production. It is simple and direct. How are you? How are you surviving? How are you holding up today? Now, I don't want to beat a dead horse because what did that horse ever do to warrant such treatment? But I will say this. If we want to get this right, if we want to choose to not go back to normal, but to move forward instead in new anti-oppressive ways, then we must strengthen a non-capitalist understanding of the human being and of all existence. Or, in other words, we must develop and prioritize new economies that are liberative rather than exploitative, that are rooted in mutual survival rather than Darwinian social ethics, and that above all else values the how over the what. I'll end by giving you a brief example of what such an alternative economy looks like. Some of you may be familiar with an organizational theory called mutual aid. For those who are not familiar, mutual aid has been studied in cultures over the millennia. In mutual aid networks, quote, communities take on the responsibility for caring for one another rather than forcing individuals to fend for themselves. In 1902, Peter Kropotkin, who defined the term as a principle for organizational theory, defined it this way, and excuse the gendered language. Man is appealed to be guided in his acts, not merely by love, but by the perception of his oneness with each human being. In the practice of mutual aid, which we can retrace to the earliest beginnings of evolution, we thus find the positive and undoubted origin of our ethical conceptions. And we can affirm that in the ethical progress of man, mutual support, not mutual struggle, has had the leading part. During the COVID-19 crisis, mutual aid networks have exploded across the world, including one in our community that has a Facebook group of over 5,000 members last time I checked. An excellent article about the recent growth in mutual aid networks speaks to the necessity of alternative economies and ways of structuring society, not just in a crisis. The article by Eleanor Goldfield highlights the effectiveness of volunteer-led, non-hierarchical structures of community building. She writes, "Mutual aid is the medicine that bodies respond well to, the antidote to capitalism, and the slave for those basic elements of humanity so ruthlessly shanked by our system: solidarity, community, sharing, and supporting. It's not about charity. Charity pities, mutual aid understands. Charity distances, mutual aid connects." Mutual aid may be one of the many ways forward as we think about how we will be with one another and in this world. I pray that we really reflect on whether we want to go back to normal, whether that life and that way of being was meaningful and life-giving. Or could this invitation, this guest at our door, be a welcome pause to step back and find a new way as a community? Take this week. Take as much time as you need to think honestly about what values, what things, what ways of being you want to carry forward. Next week, we will explore these values and those secret ingredients to staying together on the journey, staying committed to the work, and staying laser focused on what matters most. Friends, we are never turning back. And there may be some grief in that, but perhaps there's also some hope. Hope that we are going to keep on moving forward together. Hope that we will not settle for what is normal, either the old normal or whatever the new normal is, but instead stay true to ourselves and to one another until we reach that golden morning. May it be so, and amen.